Today we'll learn Chris Langen's letter to Rick Rosner, arguably the second highest IQ person in the United States, published in 1992, called Letter on the Universality of Tautology and Metaphysics. And so notice the letters in that title of CTMU. It might as well be Cognitive Tautology of Metaphysics in the Universe, that you have a U, a T, and an M, which is, of course, what the CTMU is. It models the universe through tautology and is, therefore, an unbeatable logical framework for the third millennium. So this class will serve as an introduction to all the mathematical logic that you'll need to understand the CTMU. So does anyone know what Gödel's incompleteness theorem is? Go ahead.
I know what it is. I couldn't say it to you, though. I couldn't repeat it.
Patrick, you have a hand.
I don't know the intricacies of it, but I know that it says that there are unprovable truths in the universe, and that the Gödel's incompleteness theorem shows that that's correct.
Yep, exactly. So Gödel's incompleteness theorem states that you can never have a complete and consistent set of axioms in mathematics or for a formal system, which is just an abstract structure of rules. So this means, exactly just like you said, that just because something is true doesn't mean that it is provable. And this creates a problem, because if logic can produce undecidable results, meaning we actually can't prove whether something is true or false, even if we know that it's true, then, and logic supposedly is the structure of truth, then does truth even have a structure, or are we just projecting our partially true logic onto an absurd universe? And so according to Gödel, there are true things that we can't prove, and there are also things we can't prove that are true. So to understand this, you need to understand axioms. So that axioms are statements that are so simple that they are inarguable, like a rose is a flower, or even simpler, a rose is a rose. It's like Romeo and Juliet says, it says, would a rose by any other name smell as sweet? But it's embedded within its own definition. So no amount of statements on which the abstract structure of our ideas is based, no amount of tautologies can account for itself, according to Gödel. An axiom is commonly called self-evident, and yet logic itself is not self-justifying. And Gödel's second incompleteness theorem states that axiomatic systems cannot justify themselves. Yet, according to Langen, tautology is universal, not particular to our rules of our systems for thinking about the universe. He boldly goes against Rosner, who represents the current view of mathematical logic and is the second smartest man according to popular reports, but has not yet found the virtue of the CTMU or the metaformal system, despite being in close leagues with Langen and having had multiple private discussions. So Rosner claims that systems based on tautology cannot generate, quote, interesting results. He believes that based on simple ideas, you can't get anything complex. And this sort of makes sense. Ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing comes nothing. And notice the logical structure of this. It subtly affirms, though, that tautology is nothing. It contains no new content because it is simply repeating itself. And while this might seem like a reasonable view, because in a statement like a rose is a rose, it seems as though the to be verb, the is, connects two identical relands, and the subject rose repeats its predicate rose. But it's like the old Schoolhouse Rock song. Mr. Morden is the subject of the sentence, and what the predicate says, he does. So if Mr. Morden breakdances, we now know what he's doing. But if Mr. Morden equals Mr. Morden, according to popular view, we didn't get any new information about him. It certainly doesn't seem like it. But funnily enough, to understand metaphysics and realize the truth about life, the universe, and everything, you need tautology. It doesn't get any clearer than this. The way people usually talk about tautology is as a useless repetition or redundancy. So simple it would be condescending to point out. It's like it's like, did you know that a flower is a plant or something? In logic, it describes a statement that is true in itself. It is undeniable, meaning that all tautologies reduce to x equals x, and x does not equal not x. So in x equals x logic, the key to that is that neither of the x's, neither of the relands, but the equal sign itself, the relationship, is the syndiffionic relationship that relates any two equivalent objects. So you can substitute in anything for X. So meaning that analytically, the X equals X relationship serves as the basis of connection and truth. So each X is then embedded within the analytic definition of the other, meaning that they are mutually defined as an intension-extension coupling, like we talked about previously. They're with the right X being the internal definition and the left X being a particular expression of that definition. A rose is a rose. A red rose is a rose. A spiky rose is a rose. All of these are tautological statements, but the right-hand reland represents a different expression of the idea of a rose. Would a rose by any other name smell as sweet? So the logical rule X equals X splits into two rules in two-valued logic. X does not equal not X, called the law of the excluded middle, meaning that an identity and its negation cannot be the same. And not X and not X, the law of non-contradiction, meaning that a value and its negation cannot coexist within the same identity. X is a sentential variable, which means you can substitute in any sentence or formula into the X equals X equation, and it still works. Thus, this is the most general logical rule, identity, X equals X. Because the X variables are sentential, we can swap in variables that refer to existence or relation itself, such as equality equals equality, which makes equality a self-proving proposition that is syntactically contained within its own self-description. Existence exists or reality is real are general tautologies that make existence or reality a self-attributing predicate, or 1 equals 1. 1 equals 1 is arguably the most interesting of these. I'd put it as tied with reality is real, because where the real universe is the most complex instantiation of the number 1, this means, like Patrick said about the law of 1, is that the real universe is the most complex instantiation of the number 1, which means that the universe itself self-generates through the tautological identity of unity. This should suffice to show the power of tautology in metaphysics. So logic is developed by substituting sentential variables into basic tautology, forming what Langen calls a reflexively true tautological framework. So as long as the axioms are true, the logical geometry induced from the framework is inarguable and can only be disputed from within. And yet, standard logic is a little bit like a house of cards. Remove one axiom and the whole thing comes tumbling down. But its power lies in its self-reference. We can let A in an A equals A relationship stand for the entire structure of logic, because that's one thing, that's a sentential variable. So here Langen proves that if the law of the excluded middle were true, meaning that you could have both A and not A in the same identity, then the law of the excluded middle would also be false, because if A and not A were both true, then you can substitute in A and not A for A. So both the law would be true and the law would have to be untrue, because we're saying that things are true in addition to their negation. So two-valued logic is undeniable because it implies itself. So the axioms of logic are inarguable, but the structure, the axioms themselves are arguable, but the structure of propositional logic could only be contradicted by propositions and logic, making it therefore such that one must submit to the very rules of propositional logic in order to make a sound argument against it. So therefore, there are three definitions of tautology, the strongest of which is the self-referential tautology of two-valued logic, is that we're using the law of the excluded middle, substitute in the structure of logic for A. So the structure of logic has to be true and it can't be not true. So that defines inclusion within reality. So that's a very general kind of logic in which the law of the excluded middle invalidates all contradictions against propositional and predicate logic, making it a foundation for truth. The next most powerful is any particular logical statement, such as a rose is a flower, which is true by virtue of the analytical definition of its sentential variables. And the next is is any statement that is repetitive or redundant, such as Tommy equals Tommy or a rose is a rose. So X equals X logic is extremely general, which usually makes it impossible to derive any meaningful implication from it. Thus, the CTMU generalizes tautology, which is truth by necessity of form, to autology, which means truth by self-attribution. So this is what we mean when we say that the real universe is autological. It is self-descriptive because there is nothing outside of reality by which it could achieve existence. Thus, the reality predicate is descriptively embedded within reality itself, meaning reality is self-existent, self-evident, and self-generative. This goes well beyond the standard definition of an ontology, which, if you don't know, is basically just a word that describes itself. So this is true. There are kind of some silly examples like the word short is short, or if you want to sound a little bit more like a jackass, the word pentasyllabic has 5 syllables. The word short is not short, though, by virtue of its being. Short in Russian is korotkий, and the word for pentasyllabic in Hebrew is mechumish, which is only 3 syllables. So these are only true by virtue of us interpreting them in one particular language, in one medium of writing or communication. It's not like there's some general divine rule that pentasyllabic has to be 5 syllables. And therefore, ontology, as it is commonly formulated, is not nearly as general or powerful as two-valued logic. Science itself doesn't rely on ontology. It's not like all scientific statements are, all 3-syllable statements are 3 syllables, but it relies on tautology. You get the X equals X, you substitute a theory for the left-hand sentential reland and a formal universe for the right-hand sentential reland, and attribute the former to the latter using the scientific method. So a logical statement that connects an object language and its formal universe is called a metalanguage, which makes a general statement about contexts that contain neither the statements themselves nor that to which they refer. Thus, we can induce a metalanguage from logic and then use that metalanguage in a variety of diverse contexts, meaning that this metalanguage is then replicable and immersive in any situation. So we're taking the logical structure and then deriving a truth from the relationship between those two. And then that relationship, because it is derived from basic logic, then applies to any other logical relationship. So there's a universal distributed form that is part of this metalanguage that can be applied as the formal structure of any logical relationship. So this is why logic is described in the CTMU as the structure of truth, because it denotes inclusion within reality. First, you think about the logical relationship between things, then you use that relationship to induce a metalanguage, and then that metalanguage is added to the structure of truth, applicable to everything in reality. By substituting reality into a sentential variable in two-valued logic, we can thus describe reality as an analytical whole, as one thing which we are describing, to which the entire metalanguage applies. This metalanguage being able to both describe and create reality by virtue of its self-referential and ontological structure. The most general metalanguage is that of which we've spoken in the past, the self-configuring, self-processing language, which is a general ontology like existence exists, which overcomes Gödel's incompleteness theorem because it is able to generate new axioms on the fly for its existence and derivation concomitantly with its evolution, meaning its abstract structure is created along with its natural evolution. I mean, come on, you can't argue with a word like concomitantly. It's just not allowed. So SCSPL uses tellers and syntactors as its formal structure to create new axioms as they live and make choices in an immersive and replicable context in the world, which is how our free choice affects reality through axioms that structure the conspansive manifold, which denotes inclusion in reality and therefore logical existence. The CTMU metalanguage encompasses all of reality as well as its self-generative structure, and meaning that the universe does not have a finite set of axioms that are like a brittle and undersized pot, as according to Gödel, any finite set of axioms would be for its abstract structure, but rather its abstract structure is fertile and well-aerated soil in which the nutrition of new axioms can come forth, so that new axioms can flourish and evolve towards the end of the self-identification of the real universe. So it's constantly creating new axioms on the fly for its self-generative evolution, and thus the universe is truly free in its structure and evolution. This form of logic, which extends a metalinguistic umbrella over the entire universe with a self-generative structure, could validly be called a super tautology. An example of this class being the famous reality contains all and only that which is real, with universal applicability and implications for the structure and dynamics of the real universe, which by virtue of this simple sentential tautology, reality contains all and only that which is real, describes reality as self-descriptive, self-creating, self-sustaining, and so forth. Yes, this statement is technically a tautology, but applies only to itself. But itself is all of reality because it is applicable to everything real, descriptively embedding the contents of the universe within the predicate itself. It also incorporates self-reference because its referent context is reality as a whole, which includes the logical structure of reality. Therefore, from reality contains all and only that which is real, it is implied that reality contains logical structure, which is needed for the analytical closure of the reality predicate itself. So we can thus induce the metaphysical tautology principle from pure logic. Reality has a logical structure that must be self-attributed by virtue of its analytical closure, implying that it is self-descriptive and self-creative. For regular logic or even science, it is almost never necessary for the tautological referent context or relans to be reality as a whole. It's tautological, it's not autological, and it's only a partial tautology at that. However, for metaphysics, the study of being and existence itself, the only possible context in which tautology yields any interesting results is reality itself, and through the metaphysical tautology principle, we, therefore, can study reality, which is the formal universe of any metaphysical theory, which is formulated within the context to which it refers. Therefore, we can substitute into the x equals x expression CTMU equals reality, and thus characterize the abstract structure of the real universe within the context of the CTMU, serving as a firm logical foundation for all further metaphysical exploration. By grounding ourselves in logic, we ground ourselves in reality. Therefore, at the metaphysical limit of predicate logic, tautology becomes autological. It is the very structure of truth and existence itself. Therein, Occam's razor becomes Langen's laser. As my peer Mathematical Metaphysics explains, since existence self-generates, since the structure of a tautology is automorphic, meaning it has the same mathematical structure to the structure of a metalanguage, you essentially have the most minimal and general definition of existence, which is reality as a referent context, coupled with reality as a collection of its contents, in the same structure, meaning that the two are properly defined intrinsically as one self-dual relationship, reality and its contents. So Occam's razor becomes Langen's laser, which means that the only way to invariantly define existence is by coupling maximality and minimality, not only a referent context and its equivalent sentential variables, but the very process of attribution. The universe is infinitely expanding, so unitarity and infinity are what allow for intermediate finitary structure. Therefore, the very structure of existence is tautological and self-iterating, allowing for intelligibility itself. It is Occam's razor squared, meaning that it uses the simplest possible explanation for the explanatory structure of existence itself. Substituting in the sentential variables into the x equals x tautology, we arrive at a general logical formulation of the CTMU and how it corresponds to reality. A generalization of the problem-solving principle that recommends searching for explanations constructed with the smallest possible set of elements to define the intermediate finitary structure of the universe through a general definition of existence equals that whose abstract structure is constructed with that problem-solving principle. So our theory is equal to the universe, substituting back in our definition of the CTMU as Occam's razor squared and reality as that whose abstract structure is characterized by the CTMU. We arrive back at our proposed sentential tautology CTMU syntactically equals reality. Quod erat demonstrandum. QED, thus it is proven. The CTMU is syntactically isomorphic, meaning that there's a structure-preserving mapping between it and the real universe. The CTMU can thus be defined as follows: a metaphysical formulation of logic that defines its metaformal syntax as the abstract structure of existence, coupling minimal and maximal structure within one identity to produce a self-generative tautology that attributes existence to itself, and in so doing becomes a self-reifying predicate that is universal and common to everything in reality, with everything inhering within the primary syntactor, whose syntax is defined by the self-programmatic structure of the CTMU, precluding any extra information, thus constituting the minimal definition of the abstract structure of existence, and by applying the CTMU metaformal system to itself, embeds reality's abstract structure which within its concrete instantiation, defining CTMU metalogic as the universal distributed form in which everything in reality inheres. Would a rose by any other name smell as sweet? All of that is contained within this phrase CTMU, cognitive theoretic model of the universe. It is cognitive theory that is syntactically isomorphic to its universe on the level of model theory, meaning that you have a correspondence between CTMU and reality. In other words, we can substitute in CTMU metaformal system, which is the logical rules of inference that are based off of the CTMU, so metaformal system equals metaformal system. That's the same as saying x equals x. Remember, you can substitute in any logical rule set for the x variable. So for any process, property, relation, or identity in reality, CTMU logic serves as the generic foundation for all logic and intelligibility in existence. Where the CTMU metaformal system is syntactically equivalent to unitary identity, reality, and existence, we can swap back in our sentential variables, one, reality, and existence, to create a class of super tautologies implied by the structure of the metaformal system itself. 1 equals 1. Reality is real. Existence exists. Further, because the human mind can only be studied using the human mind, human cognition itself is a tautology in the same sense as metaphysics is a tautology. Whatever the human mind thinks about, it does it within the human cognitive syntax, which includes itself and everything else to which human syntax can be applied. So for the mind, itself and everything else for reality purposes is equivalent to the phrase reality as a whole. Everything to which the human cognitive syntax can be applied can also be applied by the reality predicate. So for reality theoretic purposes, these two are the same, meaning that human cognitive syntax is isomorphic to the universe of metaphysics. So, like, fellas, you already know what's happening. Remember the definition of the CTMU that we posited at the beginning of the video. Cognitive tautology of metaphysics and the universe. Therefore, the CTMU is a tautology that extends human cognitive syntax over the formal domain of the universe of metaphysics, creating a referent domain in which reality can be logically studied by the human mind. The story begins, ends, and in the middle, probably also, it ends with tautology. It is the alpha and the omega, the A equals A, the dynamically coupled minimal and maximal structure of existence. First, we induce a tautology from the reality predicate itself and human cognitive perceptual syntax, each of which, in turn, is a universal tautology. So both reality and human, which we've called in the past HCPS, human cognitive perceptual syntax, are both a universal tautology. And then from those two basic assumptions, which are tautological, we can deduce specific information about the universe using deductive reasoning, starting with generalities and then working inwards. So as Langen says, without general info, there can be no specific info. First, we must induce a generality, and only once we've done that with appropriate logical rigor can we come up with interesting deductive theories, which are cognitive sublanguages of our more general meta-theory. This invalidates any supposition, so be it by a genius such as Rosner, Gödel, or anyone else, that tautological systems cannot generate interesting results, because tautology is the basic requirement for any informative, interesting, cool, neat, lit, chill, fresh, funky, spiffy, or hip theory. It just is. You can't get around that. Everything interesting comes from tautology because it is the basic structure of intelligibility itself, and then you can work inward from there to deduce more interesting results. So the CTMU defines information and cognition as one and the same, meaning that information is defined as being of utility to the reality system. Langen gives an example. If you know that apples are edible, but you have no apples, then you have no useful information on how to feed yourself. If you have an endless supply of apples, but you don't know how to use apples, then you still have no information about how to feed yourself. But if you both know that apples are nutritious and you have an endless supply of apples, then you have quite a bit of info indeed. So on the other hand, no number of apples alone can make apples are edible yield info on how to fix your TV. So information is context specific. It has to actually apply to the thing to which you're trying to be informed about. The CTMU's infocognitive tautology, which defines intelligence as the ability to recognize and to some extent control reality, is quantized in terms of infocognition. Intelligence is quantized in terms of infocognition, with the informational aspects of the universe being a display domain that can be processed by human cognitive perceptual syntax, and the cognitive aspect of the universe being a programming domain that generates the deep structure and dynamics of the world that underlie the world of appearances. Infocognition is thus defined as self-transducing information, with information being a generalization of the cognitive syntax of reality, which serves both as an acceptor and a transducer of its own content. An acceptor, simply in the ideas of automata in computational reasoning, an acceptor is something that simply reads information and doesn't do anything with it. And a transducer takes that accepted information, runs it through its internal self-model, and generates a new string of information. The self-transducing information model of the CTMU reflects the way that subjective cognition, such as human cognitive syntax, transduces information in time. The CTMU, through its principle of infocognitive monism, reduces the universe to infocognition, but then extends the infocognition principle to encompass the entire abstract structure of the real universe. This is how the human mind transduces information in time, drawing an important conceptual correspondence between the individual human mind and the universal mind, in which the former is made in the image of the latter, and the intersubjective medium that contains individual minds within the referent domain of the universal mind allows us to reduce reality to cognitive information, where information is the objective aspect of that which is processed by the universal mind, and cognition is the subjective aspect of that which does the design, processing, and programming for the universe. So we can thus model reality as follows. Reality is an infocognitive self-simulation in which information and cognition are self-dual to one another, with information representing the objective universe or display domain, and cognition representing the subjective world of design and potential that underlies the objective universe, equivalent to Plato's worlds of form and appearance. So reality is thus modeled as a self-simulation that uses information and cognition through this tautological structure that makes us be able to think about the universe in terms of human cognition in order to such that it is a self-simulation. It is using its own abstract structure in order for it to display itself and its physical contents. So we have certitude in the CTMU because its tautological structure relative to all humanly comprehensible reality has been built up from tautological metaphysics and human cognitive syntax itself. One cannot deny it without denying the truth of one's own existence and one's own cognition. Langen writes, formulating reality as a tautology was an obvious move. The reason no one succeeded before me is that doing so required a basic and rather counterintuitive restructuring of our perceptions and cognitions of reality. Because the metaformal syntax of the CTMU properly distributes over every domain of human knowledge, we can eliminate barriers between academic disciplines through the CTMU. As Langen says, Just as the universe is continually in the process of self-creating, human knowledge can and must continue to grow. And because the CTMU is all about cognition situated within the context of a formal universe of metaphysics, it is not a brittle or undersized pot that will root bind and choke the growing knowledge of the world, but rather a self-generative, fertile, and well-aerated soil through which the growing knowledge of humanity can spread and take hold into the third millennium. He writes, every field of human inquiry contains valuable information, but it has always been difficult to transfer this information across interdisciplinary boundaries. Thus, the elimination of these boundaries, the construction of a universal formalism, opens various realms of inquiry to relevant but otherwise inaccessible information once hidden in the alien formalisms of other realms. The liberated information is then free to combine in synergistic or even chaotic ways to reveal new insights. This is the task and promise of the CTMU metaformal system, for which we have several articles in the Compatriot Academy Substack, to formulate all disciplines cognitive theoretically and thereby bring them into consistent mutual contact with one another, forming an informational chain reaction that will lead to revolutionary insight and a new enlightenment in every formal domain, in math, science, philosophy, theology, and so forth. The CTMU provides a general, logically consistent picture of the universe, the broadest and most powerful tautology that the human mind can formulate. So there is one problem in particular that cannot be solved without a CTMU-style tautology and its attendant informational explosion, that of providing a general, logically consistent picture of the universe. That has not been achieved or even really attempted by any other models. And this owes to the fact that the basis, the root concept of any correct theory of metaphysics must be tautological relative to all conceivable aspects of reality. Because the metaphysical universe is so all-encompassing that it exceeds the set of all self-inclusive sets, Langen says, where self-inclusion is synonymous with the kind of self-description on which propositional tautology is defined, it must reduce or regress inductively to the broadest and most powerful tautology the human mind can formulate. There's only one person who could have done that and brought the CTMU into the world, Christopher Langen, and we're all incredibly lucky that he was willing to sacrifice so much by dedicating himself to this cause. Langen explains that the CTMU is a universal tautology, and therefore the only correct basis for metaphysical theorization. If there were another theory with the same criteria, call it CTMU prime, the difference between the two theories would itself be true by virtue of syndipionesis. They'd be two relands of the relationship that connects the theory. And if the CTMU is really comprehensive over all reality, then the distinction between the CTMU and CTMU prime would itself be part of the CTMU, making CTMU prime a sub-language of the CTMU. Langen says this implies that there is at most one true theory of metaphysics. No true theory of metaphysics would imply that human beings lack a cognitive syntax. If this were so, human cognition would be random and patternless. But it isn't. So there is one true theory of metaphysics, and this is, by definition, the CTMU. The CTMU already resides within each of our minds as the most basic syntax in existence. It only remains that we apply ourselves through great industry and initiative to tackle the Herculean task of becoming fluent in its meta-language. Metaphysical reality is literally human cognitive perceptual syntax. So you can search and seek and hunger and thirst for the truth. The authentic reality is that it was within you all along. And it was in the very process of dispelling all information locked up within pseudo-tautologies and false information and freeing that light to the world that you became identified with it and unmasked its hidden structures. As Jesus says to the apostle Thomas, Thomas, because thou hast believed me, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. The question that has plagued human thought since time immemorial is, how do we see an invisible God? Clearly, it is not in any of the variegated expressions of reality, but it is in identity itself, the one, the infinite source and soul of all of existence. This is the one, the referent domain of the CTMU. It is the totality of theoretical potential relative to the physical universe. Chris Langan writes, the CTMU takes this existential proof of metaphysical uniqueness and uses the implied system as the identity of a transductive algebra, meeting the conditions for human cognition by its homomorphic relationship to the human cognitive syntax. So, for the human cognitive equivalency class, the universe is generalistically identical to the CTMU tautology. Langan finishes, with the coming of the CTMU, time has forever run out on this conspiracy of the blind. The blind, sighted at last, can newly behold reality through tears of shame and gratitude, and the rest of us, freed from the rotting bonds of traditional wisdom, can finally anticipate the fulfillment of our collective identity. As a start down that road, the information in this letter alone exceeds that of a standard PhD in philosophy. Think of it as a primary gateway into logical self-awareness. Regards, Chris. Metaphysics is an antiquated term for the CTMU. There's your CTMU PhD. The rest is commentary. Now go and learn. Thank you.
Absolutely fantastic, Tommy.
Definitely.
Thank you very much. And I'll take any questions. It doesn't have to be about that, but on any of the topics related to of interest to you related to the CTMU or what I discussed.
Yeah, there was one thing you said. I don't know what an R-land is.
A reland. So a reland
Sorry.
is if you have a relationship between two variables. So let's say, I don't know, like a cat is an animal. So the two relands of that relationship, you've seen like those diagrams of syndiphonesis. It's like there are two different things, and then there's a broader relationship that connects them. So the relationship is that which connects the two, and that which is connected by a relationship is a reland.
Right. So would you say that a reland is the difference side of the syndiphonesis?
Yeah, exactly. The reland is the two things which are different, and then the relationship is the connection between the two.
Okay. Yeah.
I had a question that may or may not be. It was a question I made before we had class today about super tautologies. So I wrote closed, comprehensive, and consistent. Aren't each of these 13 axioms of the CTMU, all three of these being closed, comprehensive, and consistent?
What are the 13 axioms to which you're referring?
A reality principle, syndiphonetic principle, the map, leases, language equals reality, mind equals reality, multiplex unity, expansive duality, or the dualities. Though those are some of them. I mean, I could go through and find them all, but
I get what you're saying. So a lot of those are more clear to see how they are tautological. Like, for example, the reality principle, which is reality contains all and only that which is real, is, a very basic tautology. It's literally just swapping in the sentential variables of reality and its contents to be equal to one another, which is obvious. But then all of those, as we'll go through, and we did touch on a little bit in this presentation, are induced from those very basic principles. And so basically the metaphysical syndiphonesis is just about the relationship between things which are related by tautologies. So those are those two relands connect to one another. So you can go through all of these, but it's basically one. It's not that all of them can be expressed in like one sentence, but that they're part of a structure that is built up from tautology.
right.
Bishop, I just want to ask you, where did you see that there were 13 principles of the CTMU? I think you're right. I'm just wondering where you found that.
In the cognitive theoretic model of the universe, a new kind of reality.
Does it just lists it in the original document?
Well, it's a book, and it just goes through.
I mean, I have read the original document. I mean, I I've never bought the book, but I have read it. And I looked through all the principles. I didn't know that there were 13. I didn't find like a list of 13 principles, but it did obviously list the principles.
Right. I guess went through and counted them.
Right. Yeah. Can't really think of any other questions, to be honest.
Yeah, you answered all our questions beforehand. It was very
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, the way you explain it, it just feels so obvious, doesn't it? It's so obvious, and yet at the same time, it's so complicated and obvious.
well, tell me about utility in regards to this, because this is something that I'm trying to figure out. Usually, I don't think of a tautology as something with a utility function. Do you have any comments on that, on how a tautology can have utility?
Yeah, so that's not a fundamental feature, but it's something that emerges. I don't know if this was one of the things that you asked in your posts on the forum, which I'm going to read and respond to later today. But I think the idea essentially is that the tautology says that the universe for reality theoretic purposes consists of human cognitive perceptual syntax, or at least that which can be recognized thereby, and thus as you know from the mind equals reality principle, that reality is modeled as a universal mind with goals and intentions, and that's essentially this self-attributed value or utility, which is, as we talked about at the beginning, it's teleology. It's the will of the reality system for its self-evolution. So that's a tautological reality has a teleology, but it's not that's like, that's like part of a mathematical equation that you can get out of, x equals x. But the idea is basically that from basic tautological principles like we've discussed, you can kind of figure out that reality has to be modeled essentially as a mind. And when you ask whose mind, that's kind of a model of the mind of God. And that there's a lot of atheists who will say that certain more infantile conceptions of God are not really tenable, but with the self-programmatic structure that we're talking about, actually this is inarguable, because it's the implied definitions of the reality system by the and that which has to extend beyond it, that which the reality system implies, are the same as that of God. Is that you have to have a conscious creative intelligence that underlies the universe, and that means a general form of will that is not necessarily like there are items on like a to-do list that have to get done, but there is a general drive, like there is in artificial intelligence systems, is that you don't have to have like a stated goal. You just it has the general intention of self-identification to basically recognize itself through the consciousness of tellers, and thereby creates a universe that is like our own, that has how it's figured out that a way to do this is stars and galaxies and planets and and biological organisms that are able to then recognize and process reality and then extend information back to the reality system for the purpose of its self-evolution. And then they participate in the global intention of the reality system. So the purpose of reality is to multiplex itself through the cognition of its secondary images, and then to be able to recognize and identify itself and create essentially true and good order within internal to itself. So it's not necessarily, I think, the most helpful frame to think of this, and to think of it in terms of like, it's you have to get this teleology from the tautologies that we've discussed. Like if you were to give me all those principles and say, how should you best make a universe, I would be stumped. I'd just say we should make a universe as God has made the universe. But there is a general way that we can think about the universe, which is that the universe's purpose is, remember, so you can think of this is actually talked about in the 2004 paper Cheating the Millennium, the Mounting Explanatory Debts of Scientific Naturalism by Christopher Langan, is that the purpose of the universe is actually tautological. It's embedded within the x equals x relationship itself, that you substitute universe and universe in, and you get this general idea that the teleology, the purpose of the universe, is the self-expression of the universe, is the self-expression of reality. So reality is basically defining itself on the fly through the way that it evolves. And it does this in increasingly intelligent ways because it has access basically to infinite intelligence and a self-renewing fountain of ontological purity, strength, and intelligence that allow it to basically create constantly its goals and intentions in the world.
Okay, and that's a big answer. Said a lot in that, but I'm picking up a few things. Specifically, I can't remember exactly what you said, but you were talking about how, well, anyway, the general idea was that the universe only has itself to express itself with. And so through that process, it necessarily has to be discovering itself. And so through that process, it necessarily will lead to tellers. Am I on the right track when I say that?
I think there's already a teller, the global teller and the secondary teller. The teller is just the set or the element.
No, I'm
As far
talking
as I
about necessarily has to lead to secondary tellers. We are secondary tellers. The primary teller is the universe.
Yes.
We are secondary, and then tertiary are the, fundamental particles.
Yeah. I think that what you're tripping up on, from what you said before about where does the power, where does the will come from tautology? I think that it doesn't exactly come from tautology, but it more so comes from the conception of reality as a power set, and then in that conception, relating the set and the element through tautology. Sorry, well, you'd relate it through oxymoron, but you'd relate the other facets of existence through tautology.
Well, that's an interesting statement, but I am having trouble interpreting it.
Go on.
Are you telling me to go on? What you mean by that?
I didn't hear you what you just said.
Is my microphone not clear?
It was garbling in the front.
Sorry about that. Okay. Well, what was I asking? I'm not sure what you mean by a power set and what that implies.
Okay, I think Tommy described a power set last time as a set. It's basically the universal set which has capacity to both contract potential as well as generate actuality from that contraction.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's how the CTMU is formulated.
Sure, how this relates to the topic.
Okay, well, sorry, what was the topic?
So I'm trying to ask about utility.
Okay, well, self-defined utility, it's self-causation by definition must have a utility value which is identical to the syntax. Do you know what I mean? The syntax of all of reality, all past, future, and present moments happening all at once. It's all being, well, it's not really happening all at once. It's all being considered in the evolution of reality. That's why it's a universal set, and that's why it generalizes over all of reality. Right?
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
I don't know. I mean, of course, it is quite hard to get your head around, but to me, the problem is as simple as something which is self-defining and has its own value, has its own will, has its own thought, its own cognition, by necessity must have a utility function. And while that utility function is not necessarily defined, it is implicated by its expression through secondary tellers, it's implied from how we live. I mean, we live when we have many cells inside our body, and that in itself is sort of representative of the universe as a whole. We are all cells within the universal body, and we all have a certain will to maintain that universal body, but we have also the will to ignore it, or just not even, or just go against it.
So your argument
And
seems to be a sort of syndiphonic relation with
well,
our wills, the relance. Is that sort of what you're saying?
I don't know. Maybe I have the wrong idea about secondary tellers.
Pardon?
I mean, as far as I'm aware, a secondary teller is you and I.
Yes.
We are secondary tellers, and all objects, everything is a secondary teller. But then again, everything is like,
Well, sorry.
Yeah, not all objects, but I get what you're saying.
not everything. That there are tertiary tellers as well, of course.
No, they're syntactors. They're syntactic operators. Objects are syntactic operators.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, I think that everything is a syntactic operator, isn't it?
That's true.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be reacting to the syntax, and therefore it wouldn't be part of reality.
That's true. Yeah. But a teller is something that can use grammar for its own
Yes.
purposes. So far as I know, that's probably a sloppy definition too, but it's something like that.
It uses its own syntax. It uses the syntax of the universe, and that the syntax is basically the grammar. But like, I guess the grammar of the CTMU is the logico-geometric structure of the CTMU, and the syntax is just the thing holding it all together.
Yeah, that's cool.
Sorry, what was that, Bishop?
No, I was saying that was cool.
Yeah, but what do you think, Patrick? What about? Are you still confused about utility?
Well, I have suspicions, and I'm just not sure if they're completely true or not. Like, I think that if you understand how telesis works logically, like if you can figure it out through deduction how telesis functions, and you understand that it's cognition, so it experiences qualia and has emotions and all this, then, well, that's a will right there, because it's acting, it's doing things,
Right.
and it has cognition, and it functions in a certain way necessarily. So you can understand the will of the universe just like that. But the thing that I'm interested in, I think more specifically, is this past and future correspondence, because the utility of the universe is framed in the telic principle as, well, we know that humans are going to exist. Maybe this is not about humans specifically, and maybe it's more about, well, the universe has to know more about itself. That's why humans exist. So it's the reason that humans are here is because of like the more high IQ humans who are going to understand the universe at a deeper level, or maybe the more ethical and compassionate humans who are willing to give utility to the universe, something like that. But it's still a little bit fuzzy, and so these conversations help me solidify in my head,
Yeah.
what the reality is.
The CTMU is extremely powerful for its interdisciplinary application. But it's important that we manage our expectations about its application, since like, you can read up about history, and you can read up about religion, and you can read about all these things. Personally, I think that trying to understand telesis, a much faster way to understand telesis would be through study of ancient religions, as well as how they've manifested today.
Yeah, I think that Schopenhauer said something about this, right? He was talking about how intellectuals, they're taking the slow path, but there's some people who understand reality much quicker just through intuition.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Through mysticism or intuition. I totally get you.
Yeah, like these ancient Hermeticists and these yogis from the East, they all had these concepts before, a lot of philosophers even thought about them, because they just didn't know about it. It's like a lot, because these thoughts, it's not like, the universality of these ideas means that they're just going to keep popping up.
That's the utility function that you were talking about.
Exactly, that's the utility function. The fact that they just keep popping up, they're inevitable.
Yeah.
Like tautology is inevitable logic, and it's inescapable.
Right.
That's part of the utility. And it's just going to keep popping up throughout reality, no matter where you are, no matter who you are, or what time it is.
All right. Well, it's something for me to think more about. I mean, writing helps and talking about it helps. So thank you guys for your input.
Absolutely, mate. I write this stuff all the time. Or
Yeah.
I used to a lot more. I tried not to do it so much because it can be a little bit maddening.
Sometimes you go in circles over and over. Yeah.
But that's it. The whole thing is built on circle. It's all built on a tautology. It's a circle.
It's the snake eating its tail.
That's exactly what it is. And it's also, that's yin and yang, a snake eating its tail. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Or two snakes really trying to eat each other. That was very broken.
I think you said Tommy isn't here. Is Tommy here?
I'm here. I'm just enjoying the conversation.
All right. I guess my internet's not so good, so I guess my microphone's not working. Someone has another question here.
How are my thoughts generated? Go on, Tommy.
I'm thinking about it.
You had the
How are my thoughts generated? So essentially, this is something that's answered by Chris Langan in one of the answers, and on the CTMU knowledge base is that there are essentially, it's part of the human cognitive syntax is that thoughts are generated essentially as attributions in one's mind, and that's not entirely like I can't choose which thoughts to have. Like if someone tells me like don't think about pink fluffy unicorns for a minute, then I'm actually going to go to do that. But the reason why that thought is being generated is because it satisfies an intrinsic need in my mind, which is that I had that utility, which is to think about that thing which has been suggested to me so that I can adequately respond in the future. And then I have free choice on how to, I can have impulses or instincts or so forth. And then I have the free choice on how to actually instantiate that into the world. And I can have more powerful impulses, which then are more likely to drive me in a certain direction. But ultimately, I have the free choice on how to act upon my thoughts. And there is a way, even though, we can go into this with like the very deep psychology. This is one of the things that Freud talks about, is that we are ultimately responsible for the contents of even our unconscious mind, because it's still part of us, and one shouldn't desire to get rid of their complexes or mental patterns, but rather they should try to get in touch with them, because they are truly what drives forward our behavior in the world. And so the way that you can have your thoughts be in alignment with your will, and you can have a positive intention all of the time, is that you are able to you're able to get in accord with what Jung called the shadow, or to integrate all of these different complexes such that you're then able to exist in the world and be strong and create and confront the world, and then your intentions will actually become more loving and more polarized towards service to others. And so your thoughts are generated in some set in not in a space of unconscious awareness that is still part of you, but it's part of your broader human cognitive syntax, but it's not actually consciously chosen, if that makes sense.
I have a question about I don't really know that much about logic. I don't really know what sentential logic is.
Yeah.
Could you explain sentential logic? I know it's very fundamental.
Yeah, so when I'm talking about sentential logic, all that means is the x equals x is a sentential logic, not because it literally just means you can swap in a sentence for each of the variables. And so then that means that that's a general form of logic in which you can have an equivalence class between any sentence or any formula, which are
Right.
the same as one another. So
Is it just another way of saying linguistic logic?
yeah, so basically that's taking mathematical logic, and then you can substitute in language, and that actually makes it a more general kind of logic.
Right. Okay. So what are the main logics then? There's mathematical logic, there's linguistic logic, or sententional logic, and what are any others?
And well, there are a number of kinds of non-standard, or they're called fuzzy logics, but I think the main other one, which concerning the CTMU, is something called model theory, which is in the name of the CTMU, cognitive theoretic model of the universe, which describes the connection between theories and their formal universes. And so basically that's still part of that basic x equals x idea, but you're putting in on one side, it's not really a tautology within standard scientific syntax, but on one side you're putting in a theory, and on the other side you're putting in an observation. Those have a correspondence to one another, that they are equivalent to each other. And so Langen's critique of science is that it actually doesn't really explain the logic behind that and how mind connects to reality, or how theory connects to observation, because basically all it's doing is he literally uses this phrase, it's like the equivalent of epistemological, which means the study of knowledge. It's the equivalent of epistemological magic glue to attach its theories to its observations. And so the CTMU is a more general kind of model theory that really goes into the connection between the abstract and the real universe.
You could almost say that you could almost associate the primary teller with ontology, the secondary teller with phenomenology, and then the tertiary teller, or just self relationship with epistemology.
Yeah, so those are, but ultimately what the CTMU claims is that ontology and epistemology are the same, because it's essentially the same as what we talked about in the presentation, is that it's that which is attributed versus that which it is attributed to, is that the theory and the universe at the level of reality itself are one and the same. And so that's what we said with Occam's razor squared, is essentially that the problem solving principle, which is in the CTMU, equals that which is solved by that problem solving principle, which means the CTMU equals reality, with one serving as a theory and one serving as its formal universe. But those two are actually quite related because they're connected by the model.
Okay. Yeah, I think I understand.
All right, amazing. I'm gonna wrap up unless there are any other last minute questions.
Thank you for a great class, by the way.
Amazing. Thank you for coming. My eternal gratitude to everyone who took their time to watch this. Thank you very much, and to participate in this class. It means a lot. Thank you. God bless.
God bless. Bye bye.